Happy Halloween and welcome to Varn Blog. Punditry. You know, it's something that we do, and increasingly today, the line between punditry, journalism, and just being an average fucking person on the internet is very, very, very thin. I've been thinking lately about a phenomenon that I used to call the left's love of losers. And I mean that in a sense that we tend to reward people who are wrong, frankly. And we don't hold them accountable for being wrong. This whole tradition, this grand communist tradition of autocritique, it's not a thing that we often do, right? And we don't reward it. Now, I don't know. I mean, I've read the biography of Deng Xiaoping, and one thing I've learned from Deng Xiaoping is if you auto-critique in the right spheres, you can pretty much get away with anything. But we don't ask people to be accountable for when they are wrong. We just don't. We don't. I've been reading on Graeber and on Mark Fisher and on Bordiga. Bordiga wasn't a pundit, so I'm just mentioning him because these are the three things I'm researching for my book and intensely. I'm going back and reading most of the K-Punk articles, the ones that came up before the Vampire Castle piece that I helped publish and after the Vampire Castle piece that I helped publish. And I see very, very, very little demand for accountability. Right? Structurally, the argument that Fisher made in Democracy is Joy and the Vampire Castle, not the one against the identitarians that everyone focuses on, but the one against the sad sacks who were critiquing the Corbyn movement. And, you know, by that he meant people like me, and who were critiquing Russell Brand. He threw us in with the identitarians. Do you know why? Because he thought that our complaining about Tsipras, our Russell Brand, our Corbyn, our Sanders was somehow stopping them from winning. As if we had that much power. And then he created an elaborate psychological apparatus to justify that. I made this up. I have made many posts about this, but I remember the DSA back in its more heydays of the Jacobinite, and by Jacobinite I don't mean Jacobin in the French tradition, a conflicted but noble bourgeois tradition that Jacobinism was, but I mean it in the sense of the Jacobin magazine in America and its weird hybrid of analytic Marxism and neo-Trotskyism, but read to the right, and that the Jacobin reading groups were doing in 2012, 2013, 2014, at the very moment where the Cliffite concessions to labor were falling apart, and the ISO was ending itself in an auto-critique of realizing that its multi-million-dollar publishing arm and Haymarket Books was going to mean that it couldn't tolerate its sex scandals anymore. During that time period, we created a lack of accountability and an ability to call people out, and we still do it. We still do it today. There are pundits who I have respect who wouldn't even call themselves pundits. You know, they call themselves theorists or commentators or whatever, who would call out Joe Biden for what he's doing in Gaza, but then call out the left of the DSA for calling out AOC and Bernie Sanders for supporting Biden on that very stuff. It was maddening. But I started thinking about the nature of punditry here. I started thinking about this because it's I get critiqued a lot for saying, oh, it's not unique to the left. It's actually a general social thing. But honestly, a lot of the problems of the left is that the left says it wants to transcend current contemporary society, but can't, right? So we actually have to look at the trends in contemporary society that also the left can't transcend, whatever we mean by the left in contemporary society, which are all contested terms, I know. So let's think about this for a second. It's very chilly here, yes. I have held off on critiquing a lot of people for a long time because my audience would get mad at me. When I was over there at Zero Books and I said something even mildly critical of Bernie Sanders about the inability to build a movement to support him actually doing the things that he would need to do, and the circular logic that I've been pointing out for literally at this point over a half decade, that there was this hope that that somehow Bernie Sanders could bring about the workers' movement, but we also needed the workers' movement to already exist to bring about Bernie Sanders. And we needed to change the Constitution, even though at the time they weren't admitting that's what they needed to do, to abolish the Senate and bring back proportional representation and a unicameral legislature, while not dealing with the fact that you'd have to also completely rewrite the Constitution to do that. And it would require winning federal elections beyond New York, California, and isolated blue cities and red states to actually be able to do that. And not only did it require that, but that the areas of low bars to entry were the very places that leftists didn't want to go. Now, a lot of people are like, oh, we got sheepdogged. Motherfuckers, I was telling you that in 2018. And I let myself get captured. I let everyone just tell me over and over again that I didn't understand the American political situation, that I was gone for a decade, that things had really changed. And that was also happening in England. And that this was the history of this. And I pushed back. I said, look at the right. Look at the right. All right. And both libertarians and the alt-right, what we might call the racial critique of from the right of American conservatism, which was what the alt-right really kind of was. What happened to them? They were seemingly ascendant. Libertarians during the end of the Bush administration and into the first half of the Obama administration, the first 4 years. After the realities of 2008, 2009 really kicked in, then you started seeing these rapid growth to nationalism. And what happened to them in both cases? They had the appearance of being counter-systemic. You could freak out your enemies with them, and you could feel like you were growing. And what did they do? Actually, they liquidated themselves. And I was pointing this out in subtle ways for years. So yeah, I have a lot of anger about that. But the punditry game is larger than this. How many pundits, and I mean this from the journalist variety, the way we contemporary mean it, to the theoretical variety. I seriously had a leftist tell me the other day that Alex Jones has been more right than any leftist figure. And when I asked him, right about what exactly, I got no answer. Then I lost my patience and cut ties with the person. All right. The amount of people who scream at me because I don't confirm their point of view is very large. It's part of the nature of this game. And a lot of people get very good at giving you the exact, precisely aligned bullshit to get you to shut up and hit the like and move on. And now we have expanded that to most of society. Now, I don't think social media is inherently bad. What made social media so weird is the commodification of likes, the commodification of of dopamine hits. What was priorly a fairly liberatory bourgeois technology, of course, over time rotted. We should expect that. That's what happens with bourgeois technology, right? It is initially liberating, even in the bourgeois context. Then, as it is recaptured over time, and the commodification that was always present. I don't want to make it sound like the internet was ever not commodified. Was always present. Bam. Now we all want to be fucking pundits. And it's the last thing I want to be. I can't deny that I am. All right. I can't deny that I play a role to a lot of people, not masses of people, but actually I play this role to a lot of influential people, at least on the left, whatever the fuck that is now. People's mixtures of revenge fantasies and hopelessness, which always go together, by the way. And you see it on the right too. It's funny because everyone on both the real horseshoe theory is the dissatisfaction and alienation we met along the way. So yeah, I'm mad. I'm mad. I've been mad. And it's been building up in me for a long time. I get screamed at about everything. I'm not pro-Palestinian enough. I don't know how that happened. I was in mourning for a month after October 7th because I felt like I was going to see a massacre of Palestinians, because even in the Jewish community here, because one person died, and I'm not going to defame this person. I'm not going to name them. All right. But I knew them. They were not in the IDF, at least not any way that I know. They are very dead. All right. But I saw what the community here responded to that. It was immediately a lightning rod, and it needed to be. All right. There had been this uncomfortable silence between generations in the Jewish community here for a long time about whether or not our identity was about a national identity to a nation we didn't even belong to. And so I retracted from that minute because I wasn't going to say anything against the Palestinians. But I also saw a lot of misinformation and crazy punditry about the situation being spread. And I had no idea how to respond to it. And while I will admit there weren't a lot of people who implied I was a secret Zionist and a genocide supporter, there were people who did. When I waited a month, I didn't even wait a month to speak out. And I felt like people monetizing this was ghoulish. All right. It's one thing to get paid for your journalism. It's one thing to get paid for your considered analysis. If you speak the languages, if you've done the research, if you've been there. It's a whole nother thing to make money off of your opinion about a fucking war. Or what really was a massacre. But I decided to speak out on it because what is wrong is wrong. I made sure that there were no way that was monetized. I didn't sell anything. I didn't have any guests. And when I had guests, I even made sure that if we were talking about Israel-Palestine, we weren't hawking anything. There is very real wars going on. Don't get me wrong. And by the way, we are missing a bunch of them by only focusing on one or maybe two. Maybe people are still following what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. I don't know. It feels like everyone was talking about that. And by the way, one auto critique I have, one of my moments of punditry, was that I, under some foolish delusion, would think that Zelensky would realize what NATO was going to do to them. I was wrong, just flat out wrong. And that was a lesson for me, actually. That was a big lesson for me. With something as complicated as war, all right, you have to hold pundits accountable. And we all have ways we want this to go, right? We all have ways we want this to go. I want to say that every theory that I have about how a ruler thinks or everything I say about the future, always take it with the caveat that, yeah, you can be a coward and never make any kind of, placement, a bet. You can hedge your bets and talk about nuance all day and not deal with anything, right? And I find that cowardly. I do. And you should too. But I don't claim to know what is going to happen. And I know that the way the psychology of punditry works these days, be it journalistic pundits or even international realist pundits, and we'll get to that, or theoretical pundits, because a lot of theorists really are doing punditry that they're hiding behind the elephant's graveyard of outdated, outmoded, and forgotten philosophy. And by the way, it's not all continental either. So I've been thinking a lot about how we deal with this, because the other thing I don't want to do is the easy answer to the kinds of things I'm talking about is to just be cynical all the time. Yeah, David, I actually think that's part of what's going on, but there some of the stuff that comes out of Zelensky's mouth, I can't tell if he means or not. So nonetheless, um there's a lot of projections of hope that masquerade as critical support or as analysis, when frankly, and I cannot emphasize this enough, your fucking opinion on what is happening in a country that you have no citizenship and no vote with and no meaningful way of having solidarity with workers there doesn't fucking matter. What matters is what you can do here or wherever you're at. You're not all here, right? This stuff facilitates our ability to either coordinate actions and think through actions together and learn how to help each other across oceans, or it doesn't, and it's not likely to. There are structural reasons why it's not likely to. But I've thought about this a lot, about this way the punditry game goes and the way that this infotainment media goes. And look, I still am in it. I'm not self-exempting here. We but I can tell you, At this point, it's hard for me to know how you deal with this kind of information capture. I will be quite frank with you. Even a lot of the left critics of the Democratic Party don't seem to know the precise ways in which the Democratic Party is vile. Yes, there's obvious ways, but often there's a fundamental misrecognition of what is going on. Let's take something obvious. All the punditry we hear about Project 2025. I've said some things about it that are also punditastic that I actually don't think I could, ultimately say were 100% going to happen. One of the things I've said is if everything that was done, everything done that the Product 2025 says they want to do because it's so incoherent, it would collapse the world economy. And I actually do really believe that. And because of that, I couldn't see it not leading to some kind of internal coup. But I also didn't think that Trump really meant it. Weirdly, Trump is the kind of dishonest where he often says exactly what he really thinks. And that's a weird kind of dishonesty. You're like, what do you mean he's dishonest? Well, he's saying it in a way that's misleading. But it's a different kind of dishonesty than what you're dealing with the average cipher Democrat. It's actually somewhat similar in a lot of ways to what we saw with liberals in Obama's first term. Do you know how many liberals really and truly thought Obama was a consistent anti-war candidate? It was kind of amazing. When he did what he did in the upsurge in Afghanistan, I was totally not surprised because I listened to what the motherfucker said. But the veil of hope reigns large. Trump has mastered that shit. Now, what did the Dems learn from that? Apparently, they learned very little from the loss of Lori Lightfoot in Chicago and just decided that was a strong national policy. And that maybe all these things that they've been doing since 1968, like encouraging primaries, which, by the way, are weirdly anti-democratic when you actually figure out how they work. And all these things was a kind of way to get around the problem of their own internal bureaucracy, thus not admitting they need to undo the very things they base their whole strategy since the since the 60s on, which radically changed the organization of American republicanism, that's small r, in a way that made it seemingly have a veer of more democracy than it ever really had. And this was gamed immediately. But now it's really hard for them to control. Right? No, David, that's my point. Lori Lightfoot got beat by a more progressive unionist, not the greatest guy in the world, but someone that you can maybe work with. But yet, they seem to have learned that this cipher strategy is what they do. Like, compare the two. Like, find a person who can seemingly represent a bunch of different minority interests that has some relationship to law enforcement, so you can't come after them on that front. And who seems to be able to pivot willy-nilly between progressive and right-wing parts of the party very quickly. And Lori Lightfoot was supposedly one of those people. And in most of the cities where they ran mayors like that, they lost. They got one term, maybe 2 terms, but it's not a legacy of power. And yet that seems to be where they want to go. Now, the reasons for that are complicated, and it's like the weird relationship the Democrats have with the labor unions, which is one of mutual gaslighting in a lot of ways. Although we could go into that more. It's interesting thinking about where we are with this, right? I mean, it's also interesting in the ways in which someone like Joe Biden, who was never, ever all that progressive, but had this Walter Mondale pre-Atari Democrat-like tendency to want to keep all the coalition somehow engaged. And so, it allowed things like the antitrust suits actually going through, which were accidental, non-intentionally semi-progressive things that Trump started, but that was overseen by the Biden administration. But I think we are going to see a lot of that go away. I don't know if Harris wins, and I don't claim to know what all she's going to do. She's a damn cipher. I can tell you, however, that this period feels very analogous in a lot of ways to the 1970s and early 80s. But we should be careful when we talk about analogies. Like, I got pushback once for saying multipolarity is based off of the models of pre-1914 Europe and old style monopoly capital in the old sense of that phrase, not in the Baron and Sweezy sense of that phrase. Competition between nation states that was going to morph into colonialism and neocolonialism, and I got told, well, it's not like 1918. And of course, it's not exactly like 1918. There's a bunch of big differences, one of which is drone systems, nuclear weapons, advanced powers, and integrated, highly integrated, even with decoupling economic system. Imperialist powers who both hate each other are still working together on certain issues. Like, that world is a war we live in. And yet I do that to get people out of thinking this is a simple Cold War mentality. All right. I've been trying to get people to realize that the Cold War mentality is like an attempt, and a very botched attempt, actually, to bring back some internal unity to a bourgeois nation whose civic nationalism has long since decayed. Trust me, if the civic nationalism wasn't decaying, the flip to its racial biological construct would not be as appealing to certain people. And it's easy to dunk on the liberals. We have to dunk on the fact that the leftists also misrecognize this. Why in the blue fuck does anyone think they have any leverage with even hundreds of thousands of people on the Democratic Party when they don't have money and they're not really concentrated enough and are diffuse enough, actually, in either direction to really, really start flipping areas? And in fact, their strengths are in areas the Democratic Party already controls. Game theoretically, and there's all kinds of problems with game theory, but game theoretically, that seems like a very easy way to become a self-captured constituency. No, let me actually be very clear with you about the fringe right. If the government was really scared of the fringe right, if they meant all that stuff about civil war that they were floating in 2020, if you guys remember that, a lot of people would have been rounded up and put in camps for real. And I don't mean by the Democrats, I actually mean by the military. But let me be quite frank with you. I'm not saying the threat of right-wing violence is not real. I'm saying the threat of right-wing violence that is actually destabilizing to the government, the windows for that are quite small. They're possible. There's a bunch of possible places for them, and we shouldn't totally discount them. But they're not particularly large. And when I see you guys talk about arming up, well, I mean, they did put people in jail. Yeah, you're right. Hundreds of people in jail, but they didn't really throw the books at them as hard as we did expect them to if they thought it was a lot more serious. But actually, if you want to talk about the point I'm making is that point is a point where it could have mattered. That's that, that is a conjunction point. But if you think that it'll go well for you, I mean, do you think that you won't see stuff like what happened to the Move Coalition in the 80s or even on the right to Waco and Ruby Ridge? Do you think you won't see that against leftists? I mean, we've even forgotten already about what happened to the anarchist movement in the aughts um, during the Green Scare. But it's also destabilizing. All right. And destabilization, I'm going to give Lenin a lot of credit for this. Lenin actually was pretty clear about the use of leaderless resistance or propaganda by the deed or lone wolf terrorism, which was not a critique of direct action. Bolsheviks had no problem with direct action before people come at me about it. But because it actually drove a whole lot of their own constituency out of fear into the arms of reactionary forces. And Lenin was pretty clear about that. The fact that people who would talk, I mean, I'm quite honest, when people talk about this on social media or on podcasts, I do wonder what the hell they think their problem is, because even if it was something that you would actually intend to do, um, talking about it that way in a way that's so easily traceable back to yourself in such a security state that the mediums you're using aren't even in your control or ownership seems really stupid. I'm not telling you uh, not to arm yourself or to arm yourself. And frankly, even if I was going to do that, I wouldn't do it in this forum. If I had advice for people personally, it is practice with a shooting range, know how to use a weapon, but probably don't keep one in your house, because a lot of you have people who are depressed in your house, and the most likely person to die by that weapon is you. I understand, but even hypothetically, I don't think it would work. I'm not saying you should rely on the government to protect you either. I'm just saying it's not something that you want to make an official policy. That's pretty far off the field of punditry. But I'm thinking about punditry now because I'm thinking about what's happened to journalism in the United States. We still have our major journalistic outlets. There's the cable news, which is basically ideological entertainment for aging boomers. There is the newspaper cycle, which is increasingly defunded, and half of it seems to be about what happens on Twitter or X or whatever the fuck you want to call it now. And even that's declining because a lot of liberals have now left that sphere. And then there's the Substack newsletter world, which I've critiqued, and people have wondered why I critique it. I am very much let a 100 flowers bloom, let everyone talk. I'm not for censorship on a lot of this stuff. But there is no accountability mechanisms in this. And what you see when it comes in international politics, I think you can see in the career of Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald was incredibly useful, regardless of what you think about his political opinions, when he's doing reporting on wars and military actions and this sort of thing. As he has been reduced to punditry and trying to stay relevant by defending people like Alex Jones, it has been embarrassing. But while you can pay yourself off of Substack, even someone as rich as Greenwald, and we have to remember Greenwald is independently wealthy, would have a hard time funding, without bankrupting himself, major self-investigative journalism. It doesn't scale on the newsletter model. So what we get is the equivalent of all the journalists that we used to be able to trust on foreign policy having every incentive to turn what they do into punditry and to get paid by somebody, because someone's got to pay for it to be done and someone's got to grant access, which means most journalists today, whether we like it or not, whether they are mainstream or independent, need patrons, and their patrons have agendas. And that has not changed because we moved to a more fragmented media space. What is easy to do and easy to keep the outrage bait going is to do culture war punditry. And how many people, even on the left, have been ruined by making what the culture war battles on Twitter the primary fucking thing they talk about. While they might talk about transcending the culture war, getting out of the duopoly, or, breaking from the Republicrats, or whatever fucking stupid phrase word they want to throw at you in any given day, can they do it? And the answer is fuck no. Whether they had a choice or not is irrelevant. All right? Quit making it about moral anything. You're supposed to be fucking materialist, aren't you? Look, I don't sit here and say I can offer international anything. Here's what I'll tell you. I had a friend of mine who rightly called me out of this. He said, you don't offer international analysis because it makes your audience mad. It doesn't make my audience mad. My audience doesn't listen to the shit. They don't get pissed off at me when I ask someone to talk about Boric or what's going on in Peru, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem that I have is that at best, I can get one expert with one opinion on, maybe two. There's no way for me to get enough people involved to meaningfully say that I understand it enough to do ruthless critique, or to tell you who to critically support, or that your critical support's even going to matter. I would need a news operation. I would need millions of dollars. The height of that reporting, if we are frank, has largely been privatized. And I don't mean like privatized, like, oh, you have to pay for good news, although that's another thing. Punditry is often free. News is increasingly costly, which we would expect in the knowledge economy. And it's actually kind of surprising it took so long for people to figure that out. But it has real cost, real social cost. I mean, punditry is easy. We don't, it's seen as an ideal job. Who doesn't want to be validated by having your opinions listened to by hundreds of thousands of people all the time? I mean, even if you're a goober like the amazing atheist, to bring back old YouTube. Who doesn't want it? I mean, it must feel amazing until it doesn't, until everyone turns on you, which is almost inevitable. I mean, I think about this in terms of power law, right? The way this works. I can tell you, I make, I think, about $20,000 a year, maybe more than that. I'm deducting taxes. Actually, less than that when I deduct taxes. So after taxes, I make maybe $18,000 a year, $17,000 a year, from a very successful Patreon and a not so successful YouTube. And I'm in the top like 70% of Patreons and the top 90% of downloaded weekly podcasts. Right now, the people who are in the top 1%, they make a lot of money. I mean, guys, you guys enabled the Chapo Trap House kids to retire to Silver Lake before they were even in their 50s. Not a bad living. But what do they really get you? And the line, I remember for years people would just tell me, "Oh, it's just entertainment." Really? That's not why you listen to it. Not why you listen to it. You listen to it because it validates things about you. And you see there's this thing they do, and I don't even disagree with everything they say. I want to put this out there. I don't hate Chapo, and I think I actually deeply respect Matt Christman in many ways. I don't think he's always right, but I respect him deeply. But there's this way in which there's this radical pivoting between milquetoast politics at home and a very like left wing of the progressive movement, basically. To the left of someone like Sam Cedar. And Sam Cedar is, not a person. People call him a grifter. I'm like, no, that man's been honest about who he is since the Bush administration. He's been an Air America guy the whole time. Chapo still does stuff. They do it much less numbers, but they're still in the top 2 or 3 Patreons that exist. Just a fact, guys. Cedar's just a left liberal. It's always what he's been. He's never lied to you about it. There are people who are grifters, and there are people who lie to you. But it's usually people who pretend to do other things. And I'll call out names and name names, but on this issue, I think sometimes we get mad at people for our own capture. Like we captured ourselves and we blame them. That's a buyer beware issue, isn't it? But I've been thinking about a lot of the people in the media are handsome. I mean, David Grisham and Matt Leck are both very striking, and they're like both 6 foot tall. I'm a little potato man. I can deadlift a ton of weight, but like, you know, and I can take a ton of pain. Um, if we're being macho about it, but I'm never gonna be a pretty boy like that. There's no way. And I'm not saying they're just that either. I don't want to sound like I'm insulting them. It's the fact of media is it does help to be striking looking, and if you can't be handsome, at least be ugly in an interesting way. I've been thinking about it though. I've been thinking about the punditry thing and like what people build, the audience people build, and how pe- people get so captured in this feedback loop. You can't talk to them, you know. That you can't talk sense to them. They will automatically dismiss you. Um, and it's obvious in things like when we talk about incels or racist or this, that, or the other. What's my max deadlift? I don't know. I think it was a lot. I think it was something like 350 pounds last time I checked. Um, yeah, I used to be over 350 pounds. Eh, In fact, if you want to know a truth about me that I talk a little bit about, but don't talk a ton about, I'm still a heavy guy. Like I said, I'm a potato man, but uh, I wouldn't show my face on a camera. People will talk about if you follow me on social media, you see me do selfies all the time. The reason why I do that it is kind of a narcissism. Um, but it's also because I got so disconnected from myself, I wouldn't even look myself in the mirror for like a decade. I injured myself really badly in college twice. Once by really damaging my knee when I was wrestling, and another time by um, an incident as a corrections officer, which was a good reason for me to stop fucking doing that terrible fucking job. Um, but anyway, in response to that, uh, I gained something like 150 pounds in 2 years. Oh, I was a big dude. I've always been a big dude, but I used to be a really big dude, and I was kind of a blood sport athlete in a little bit, and totally I'm still paying the price for stuff I did in my 20s, like physically. Um, but nonetheless, but I wouldn't like when I first started interviewing with Doug Lane. When Doug Lane mentioned that I might have to go on camera one day, I told him to fuck himself. No, I said I was a short little potato man. I'm 5'8". By small, I mean short. I'm not tall. I don't lie about my physicality, or I try not to lie, period. But that's one thing I really don't lie about. I'll tell you what. Um, I mentioned that I was conservative till I was like, to go fuck yourself. It hadn't been a long time. I feel like being mean to Doug now. There's this perception that I like people are like, I know you dislike Doug, and like that's just totally fucking wrong. I disagree with Doug. Um, I don't dislike the man at all. I mean, honestly, if we're completely fair about things, I owe a lot to Doug Lane. I do. I do. Really do. Oh, you damn Scandinavians and Germans. Anyway. I have learned to separate out a political disagreement from a personal one. Now, does that mean I have always been happy with things Doug has done? Absolutely not. And I do think it is dangerous as a political commentator, a pundit, so to speak, or a theorist, to make your political theory your job. Because you cannot, at a certain point, resist trends, or, I mean, you can, but it's harder. It's harder, and the incentives are bad. I'm not saying that entrepreneurs or left media figures are necessarily bad people. I know a ton of them. Most of them are decent human beings. Not all of them. Some of them are really shitty. I'm not going to lie, but most of them are okay. Will there be violence on the left as Trump wins? I mean, I've literally been talking about how I can't predict the future. So I don't know. My guess, however, is that we are in a period of social exhaustion, and the left is more focused internationally in a way that will change their orientation towards what Trump does. But that does not mean that there's not a threat of violence against the left, or of less violence against Trumpists if it was to break out. Here's the thing. I believe in left unification, but I believe left unification has to be based on programmatic unity, not sectarian unity, and not fucking vibes. And not just because people call themselves left. Now, if you're asking if there's going to be violence if Trump wins, there's going to be violence whoever wins. Probably. I mean, you can put money on violence in America. But what that's going to be and what it's going to do, I have no idea. I can tell you a few things. Trump's economic policies, if he answers, if he actually does what he says. Now, again, if we think about what he said in 2016, that's a coin flip. Programmatic unity is the agreement on terms, and the you can't, like, sectarian unity, and the way I use the word term sect and the way Marx critiqued it, etc., is based on like an absolute vision where you have people who totally agree with you or you totally don't. That is popular in times of inability to do anything, frankly, because it's easier to double down then. Now, I'm not here one of these people to throw around the terms purity fetish or purity, because all the people who use that tend to use that to get people to shut up. And people are like, oh, you're talking about Midwestern Marx. No, I'm actually thinking about the people who threw that purity argument around first were the Corbynites and the Sandinistas, so to speak. I actually found that exact argument that is often attributed to Midwestern Marx and Mark Fisher in 2015's Democracy is Joy. But you have to have some level of unification. That does mean you have to have a minimum standard. You can't be like, oh, anyone who calls themselves a leftist is on board. No, absolutely not. But you can't try to dictate what everything's going to be. You have to build a program, and that program's going to come from an interaction with socialists and the larger class, and it has to be tied in with goals that are beyond any one nation. But since we have to operate politically in the paradigm of nation states, we have to deal with that first. And this is not about just voting. This has to deal with social formations that are larger than that. Voting is literally the least you can do. So, what do you do? There will be compromises in a working class or broad-based socialist movement. It will always be of mixed character. There will be some people who we think are too liberal. There will be some people who we think are social reactionaries. I'll be quite frank, what matters is that you keep them out of leadership. And that you can hold them accountable if they start alienating other people in your thing, just like in a union. And yes, there are some instances where voting can be actively harmful, or where being delusional about voting can be actively harmful. I mean, the way people have talked about, like, Jill Stein, I don't want to get into that. If anyone wants to vote for Jill Stein, more power to you. All right. This is not my concern. I actually think focusing on the executive is the wrong place to focus. But if I was going to build a party, I would be doing more than the executive run. I know why they want to do the executive one, because if you can get 5% on an executive run, you can start to get federal funding. But if you have no apparatus to build into beyond the executive run base, I don't know what you really have. Now, if people can't stomach voting for Kamala Harris, or the party that is condoning this, particularly at the national level, I completely understand. I completely understand. Zane, I would agree with you that Arab Americans should maybe for their own party. The problem is Arab Americans are not a huge part of the population. They're a big enough part to matter. Yeah, if you want to do that, just show support for Palestinians, I got no problem with you doing that. I'm not here to shame people or tell people they need to vote for the Democrats. All right, because that's a way to be a captured demographic. But I'm also tried to tell people that, like, you do have to deal with politicians on the ground in your local area. There really is no way around that, even in a revolutionary situation. Do you think the Greens will hit 5% this time? I don't know. I really, again, punditry, trying to avoid. But I'll tell you what I've seen in the last few days. All right. I walked around my neighborhood in 2020. Almost every third house had a national presidential campaign sign. I live in a mostly Latin, blue-collar neighborhood with some professionals who moved in from California since house prices have gone crazy, and people like me who are like teachers who can't afford to live in the nice part of town, but we live in the city. Let me tell you my stance on the last time we got anything close to that was Ross Perot, and Jill Stein has done nothing like that. However, given the placement of the votes on the every house had a Harris sign. This is interesting. See here, I don't see a single Harris sign in this part of town. I have seen 3. So I think it's interesting about the different regional distinctions, because you shouldn't take my regional anecdote to tell you where things are going. But what I also haven't seen is Trump signs. I have seen all kinds of signs for Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. But another thing I've seen a billboard for Jill Stein. I haven't seen a billboard for anybody else. Maybe they don't need them. On the ballot here, both the Green Party and the PSL candidate, although they weren't under the PSL's moniker, they were on as just independent candidates. Yeah, I live in a mostly Latin and Polynesian neighborhood. Yes. You were more likely to hear Spanish in my neighborhood than English. Yeah, you have to deal with elected bureaucrats too and unelected bureaucrats. So I've seen all kinds of Republican and Democratic signs, but I haven't seen them for the national candidate that much. Now, I'm gonna say this again. When I was in rancher country in South Utah, that Spanish is funny. In South Utah, I saw tons of Trump signs. I saw a Trump banner. And like I said, I've seen a billboard for Jill Stein here. We also had 9 presidential candidates here. The PSL is a group that I will work with but not join. I'll just leave it at that. So, what do we know about the situation here? Some people are very motivated, some people are not. The regional calculuses seem very strange. It is very different here than it was in 2020. Should we judge people by their virtue signaling on signs? I don't know. I will say I've seen some Republicans for Harris. Actually, ironically, here when I've seen Harris signs, I've seen 2 of them in my neighborhood, and they were both Republicans for Harris. But I don't live in a very Republican neighborhood, so I don't know what that means. And we also have to be very careful, all right? I'm talking to an international audience right now. Mostly Americans. I also have a lot of Canadians and the English like me. I don't know why I insult them constantly, but nonetheless, for people who don't know, I'm really harsh on the English. They're not about convincing people either, though. I mean, this may be something that you and I disagree on, DV. I often do think when I'm in like Republican areas where everyone already feels like they're, I don't know if you guys know much about Utah politics. Right now, there is a kind of turf battle in the GOP here. There's a faction of the LDS who are aligned with figures like Ezra Taft Benson, who are very Trumpist and who lost out in the primaries here in Utah. And they've tried to unseat the governor unsuccessfully. but in a way that doesn't create an opening for the Democrats. Weirdly, this is actually like a strange scenario, and I don't know any other state that's like this. But dominance and expectations. Yeah, so it's a way of it's not so much virtue signaling as social conformity, and I don't mean that in a negative sense necessarily. Makes sense. That's probably what it's doing in those rancher state areas. I think here actually what it indicates to me is that it's actually a lot more that the electorate in Salt Lake is a lot more contentious than it wants to show. That's the way I would read that. But again, I don't really know. I won't know if I'm right until after the election. I'm not going to do that shit that we saw. God, I remember a certain socialist blogger who doesn't use their real name, and I used to mispronounce it, who was trying to make the argument that the Dems were a working class party. And I was like, well, the Republicans aren't a working class party. They're upper petite bourgeois party of the 100,000 to 250,000 rural area voters. But the Democratic voters are weirdly split between the working poor and parts of the blue collar, the urban blue collar, and who also largely don't vote very enthusiastically, and a lot of financiers. So yeah. And the thing is, right now, there's this term on the left where that we see that finance capital is parasitic, which it kind of is. I don't want to, but they don't. But they somehow are trying to pretend like commodity-based capital isn't, which confuses the shit out of me. I know that commodity-based capital does add to the general surplus, but it adds to the general surplus for capitalists, not overall society. And there are times, if you look at times historically on the amount of percentages of real production, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, versus finance capital, where finance capital actually does seem to be generative of the social surplus because it creates the ability to leverage time. But the profits in that, and I put, again, because they're still dependent on profits somewhere else down the line, someone's got to make money for financiers to make money. There's no way around that. Are too easily valorized. But there's also one of the interesting things about the US economy is there's a difference between diffuse old money, which is often not finance capital based, and doesn't show up on the wealthiest people list because it's families holding it. And a lot of those people got rich even in a lot of the people who got rich in the mid-century, in the 1950s, they're still fucking rich. It's just now it's all their kids running everything, and they're not even bothered to run their, they've turned all that over to managers. And everything's held in trust funds and is diffuse. Whereas the newly rich have larger, obvious accumulations in one person that show up. But we don't even really know who all the fucking millionaires and billionaires are. Creates the ability to leverage time. This is classical economics. So if you use finance to leverage the costs now versus the likely profits in the future, you can produce more because you're paying some price off of having more capital that you don't actually have. You're paying a price for that in the terms of a rent, right? On the interest rate. But if your profit valorization is higher in the future, or you can leverage like inflation or something against that, you can actually produce more now to make profits in the future that outweigh the cost of borrowing. So in that case, it would be productive. But right now, one of the things that's totally dependent on is long-term thinking. And what have we seen with corporate structuring in America is a complete inability to do long-term thinking, legally ensconced into the way we have to pay out shareholders. Which I don't want to I'm not what people take that to think, oh, we just need to go back to the good old entrepreneurial capitalism. It's not what I'm saying, because it can't be done. The problem is you can't leverage that forever because profits won't always go up unless you include other rents and stuff in them, which is part of why you don't see clean profit rates going down or up today. It's even hard to figure out what a profit rate is because it's hard to figure out what is a rent and what is a price. But the old money in America, it's harder to see what they operate on. And you're absolutely right. You see them in most of the political class. They haven't needed to be productive in any capitalist sense in a long time. How dare you imply that I am English? So time leverage is synonymous with capitalist efficiency. It can be, but not always. It sours. If it eventually can become unproductive. I mean, it's interesting to me because I actually was taught some of this in like basic, and a lot of basic Econ 101 bullshit is just wrong. But like this stuff I was taught, and they didn't hide it from me. But since we're talking about Punditry, I want to kind of stay on theme for a second. I know me staying on theme is on a live stream is weird. It's part of why I don't do them a lot. I am my mind has always got 1,000 thoughts in it, and they're not all smart. Some of them are very stupid, and I can fall down a bad trail. Yeah, exactly. Boschkor. Economics is a lot like physics. What you learn in 101 isn't really true, but you have to take the later classes to learn why. And even then, you have to figure out, even in the later classes, what they're bracketing out of the equations, right? One of the most crazy things I realized is like equilibrium requires the abolition of time. The thing is, Colin Drum doesn't believe in economics at all. I debate with Colin Drum about the meaningfulness of economic statistics all the time. Often I agree with some of his critiques, but I don't agree with the fact that like GDP measures bullshit actually isn't the same as it being meaningless. But Colin and I are somewhere in the multiverse. There's a neoliberal barn. There definitely is a neoliberal barn. But anyway, you're always trying to make this out on people that I interact with, and I think Colin's kind of brilliant, cranky as fuck, but brilliant. I'm not sure, as I've said, that we might be ideological enemies in some ways because he's such a diehard anti-Marxist. But often, if I'm completely honest about some of what he's attacking people who are bullshitting us on what Marx said. And sometimes I'd rather deal with that. I'd rather deal with an enemy who's like saying, "Hey, Marx makes testable claims and we can test him," versus people who don't, and who are always vagifying everything so we can't know if they're right or wrong. And that's what, if I haven't talked about theory pundits, right? I mentioned it a little bit when I was being kind of angry about Fisher. And I feel weird being angry about Fisher because I want you guys to know that I think the world would be much better if he was still alive. I would have loved to see what he learned from the ashes of Corbynism. Mark Fisher, capitalist realism guy. If he'd have gotten over blaming other leftists for saying things he didn't like about left populism, which I do think he would have done. He was a reflective person. I had many conversations with him through chat. I didn't talk to him in person. We weren't friends. I wasn't in Britain when he was alive. But we did have exchanges a lot. It's anti-theory, basically. Oh, well, then maybe theory shouldn't suck. Marx's theory, but it's also empirically verifiable or not. You can test Marx's claims or not. And I don't mean labor theory of value. That one isn't testable, but there's all kinds of things you can test. Now, there are ambiguities in Marx. I'm not saying we should become Anglo-brained empiricists because empiricism itself hides its norms. The clarity that it breeds is false. Child, and I'm going to call you a child because you're acting like a petulant child. Labor theory is absolutely essential, but from labor theory becomes things you can test. You can test it. The fundamental premise is not testable. It is, in some ways, both normative and descriptive. We need theory. But if your theory generates nothing but words and vibes, get the fuck out. No, I'm not contradicting my own understanding. You don't understand what I'm saying. And instead of asking me to clarify, you're acting like a petulant little bitch. Excuse me for that misogynistic statement. I am coming on. I'm telling you. I am telling you that you need to be, that if your theory has no empirical implications, who cares? However, you cannot have empirical norms. And you cannot operate without norms. Without norms, there's literally no way to speak. And if you'd have asked me to clarify that instead of just getting combative, I wouldn't be as combative with you. I apologize for calling you a mean, nasty name. Look, this is an improvement. I used to challenge everyone to a fight. I'm sorry, dude. You came at me, and I'm like, I don't even disagree with some of what you're saying. I don't know why you're coming at me. I don't believe Here's what I'll tell you. I'm not a Popperian. I do admit that we have to have norms. You have to have a theoretical foundation, and there's no way around that. This is why labor theory of value is so interesting. I cannot prove that labor and value as a concept, because it is an abstraction, is something that exists in the world in an empirical way. You're absolutely correct about that. I can prove mathematically that there is an aggregate of profits out there, and there is something like value. I understand the power theory of value critique, that this is unempirical and it's kind of made up categories, but the problem is their theory of power is also unempirical and kind of a, like, they're like, look at this index of what I'm like, so, you know, I just don't see it. But my issue is more like dealing with stuff that's, for example, I'll give you an example. In Deleuze and Guattari, they reappropriate M to MCM prime to be some general theory of history and not a theory of economics. Or in value, there's this reappropriation of the word value that's an equivocation, where we talk about value in the specific Marxian sense and then talk about values as norms in general. Right? These are not empirical, and they're not honest arguments. They're actually fundamentally dishonest arguments. Right? They don't flow logically, and they don't flow conceptually. No, we can go back to Aristotle, and I'm with you on that. All right? We're doing a dialectic here. I am pulling back from my other antagonism, and we're going to sublate this. You can't, you can't really understand Marx unless you have a Hegelian. Well, I shouldn't say you can't. You can actually probably come to some approximation of figuring out Marx without this, but it helps to understand a Hegelian reading of Aristotle and Epicurus to really get what Marx is on about. For example, when Marx talks about material reality, right? We don't just mean what the empiricists mean, like that there is, I don't know, the quantitative experience of whiteness or whatever. We know that there is this is not a term Marx would use, but a semiotic relationship to how we can interpret the mass out there that emerges from Marx. And Marx, it emerges from reality itself. Like, reality exists, the theory becomes clearer in that absolutely, that's the difference between bourgeois economics and Marx. I mean, bourgeois economics, I think about I want to, you want to, finally, we're back on the same page. Let's think about the difference between historical materialism and dialectical materialism. Those aren't terms Marx used. Those are terms given later, but we're just going to use them here because they signify a complex of thought. Not all of which is Marxist, but we can stay in that. We don't have to, we can admit that, right? And we look at that use of Aristotle versus the praxeology use of Aristotle. So what do I mean by the praxeology use? Has anyone ever studied right-wing weird economics, like the Austrian economics, like von Mises and Rothbard, etc.? That only me because I was a weirdo in my youth. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Because praxeology actually shares a weird relationship to Moses Hess's, and like it does have a similar lineage. Yeah. So in praxeology, we operate off of axioms, right? We do the Aristotelian predicate logic thing, and we just operate off of axioms. And you try to just, from these economic axioms, you don't even need math according to like von Mises. You can like deduce all these kinds of things. And what I found really funny about this is I used to read the von Mises Institute back in the day, like when I was a weirdo quasi right winger, and when I was a right winger too. But I became obsessed with it for a while, even after I left it, because it was so bizarre. And I would use these praxeological arguments, and they would use them to argue completely opposed things off of the same premises, right? Because there's nothing but the logical deduction checks from the premises. And if you change the premises even slightly, you can pretty much argue any fucking thing you want. And you would, if you pointed out the contradictions in it, they would just like shut down. One of the great ones is, they would say, oh, we just believe like you guys that labor justifies value. That's labor justifies property. And I would be like, okay, but if you buy property from your labor that was stolen, how is that not coercion, right? Blow up, shut down, dead in the water, right? And that, that's general libertarianism, but praxeology is a weird use of Aristotle. The other people who really loved Aristotle were the fucking objectivist. Which their reading of Aristotle is batshit, but it is based off of like reducing everything to deductive logic. They'll ignore the virtues, they ignore everything else in Aristotle, they ignore the distinctions of theories of knowledge, the difference between theoria, proesis, episteme, etc. But they would leave it to the deductive rationality. We don't do the deductive stuff that much. And I mean, you still have to kind of understand basic deductive logic for dialectics to make sense. But like part of what dialectics is about is a contestation over premises. And where do our premises come from? Where do these fetishes of abstractions come from, right? They're not obvious in the world exactly. And there's something undergirding them. They're all Stoics now, except that they don't even understand that Stoic morality and shit was actually based off of the belief in a physical god, or physical gods, Zeus, of which your pain and suffering were manifestations of it because you were an atom in this physical god. Weirdly, that thought emerges again in Hobbes. Hobbes's metaphysics are bizarre, but nonetheless, that's where Stoicism went. Anyway, I got a question that's not related to that. No, you're right. They weren't interested in structures at all. And in fact, they're trying to bracket out two things, structure and time. And you see this in equilibrium economics, like clearly. Equilibrium economics can only work if there's a symmetry of information, and a symmetry of information is only possible through the abolition of time as a constraint. Yep. Yeah, that's also, yeah, you're right. The Stoics believed in astrology because they believed in the universe was a manifestation of God. I got a question about why do you think communism removed from civil rights history? Only thing mentioned is MLK was a socialist, but not the SDS or the communist orgs in the movement. But here's the thing: the SDS didn't start out as a communist org, for one thing. It had communists in it from moment one, but it wasn't always a communist org, and everyone wants to delete that whole trajectory because it kind of makes both sides look bad. But the other orgs that were deleted out, I think we know why they were deleted out. Because liberals wanted to defend them and keep their Cold War liberalism intact. I mean, like, duh. I mean, like, yeah, I'm attributing causal psychological motivations that I can't ultimately know, and I'm going to put a pin in that. But it seems pretty clear that there's a liberal victory narrative about the arc of history, that the fact there were so many communist involved in the civil rights movement, and the fact that Democrats at the time are willing to deal with them, they don't want looked at. And part of it is in the context of the Cold War, both fighting the Cold War and defending themselves from people like Birchers, who were exaggerating, the communist influence in the civil rights movement, but they weren't making it up. They were lying about all kinds of other stuff and creating all kinds of conspiracies. I don't want to make the Birchers sound like they were honest, but, they clearly weren't totally making up. There was communist influence in the civil rights movement. I mean, for a while in the 1950s, if you were a black intellectual, one of the only ways to get patronage to do what you were going to do, particularly if you didn't have employment at a historical black college, was to get patronage from the Communist Party of the United States. And trust me, almost nobody reminds people that Lorraine Hansberry was a communist who got an address with RFK. Neither side of that equation, is totally happy with that. Even today. I mean, it's not like you see, if the Marxist-Leninist movements today might claim some like historical revisioning of the Popular Front, but they're often actually trying to claim the Popular Front while also claiming third periodism, which you kind of can't really do. Yeah. The high point of the communist movement in America is 1970 and 1957. There were state bans on communists before there were national bans, and they started almost immediately after World War II. When being a communist was re-legalized, however, the Sino-Soviet split made that hard to really do a whole lot about. This is part of the Rockhill-Lacerdo line that I don't love because they erase the effects of the Sino-Soviet split on the U.S. communist movement. Yeah, Hansberry was a member. I don't know if she was a member when she died, but I know she was a member for a long time. Yeah. Yeah. I'll look up the dates on that again. I remember being shocked when I learned it. What do you think about the Lacerdo Rockhill now arguing that all Western Marxists were basically in the pocket of CIA? That's too simple, but there are, I'll tell you, for example, some of what Rockhill says in the Frankfurt School is valid. And I think his argument against Zizek is very valid. I don't think Zizek's in the pocket of the CIA necessarily, but there's a bunch of very bad counter incentives there. And I think what Rockhill says about Hannah Arendt is absolutely true. So I don't want to say it's without merit. The Lacerdo argument is weirder and harder to actually completely go into. I've read the Western Marxism book. It's not a terrible book. It's also not a great one, in my opinion. For example, I don't know why you consider Foucault a Western Marxist. And I think it's weird to cite Bloch before he's a Marxist and then after 56, but nothing in his actual high Marxist period. And so I find them very selective. And I think the CIA, I mean, look, if I went after everyone who had a tangential relation to the CIA from a Fulbright, it would probably also hit a lot of the people talking. That said, I also think throwing Gabriel Rockhill under the bus or pretending he's a conspiracy theorist is totally dishonest. And he will actually say he doesn't think Western Marxism is irredeemable. He just thinks that there are crucial mistakes there. I have some issues with some of Lacerdo's other arguments, particularly his book on Hegel, where he basically argues that we don't ever need to worry about the abolition of the state, and a few other things, which I don't think in themselves are right-wing deviationism, but I think can easily lead to right-wing deviationism. So, I'm a little bit more cautious. But the people who didn't want that Western Marxist book published, and that Stalin book published in English, actually, if they were afraid that of Lacerdo, them doing that made Lacerdo infinitely more popular. It was a very stupid thing to do. And it's not like they weren't perfectly fine publishing other Stalinist, quote unquote. Well, here's the thing: boomer culture was not nearly as radical. Like, I don't love Rick Perlstein. I mean, the guy literally got in a fight with Tim Baker and said, "Vote for slower genocide," and he was kind of being ironic, but not really. But Perlstein's argument about the actual left-wingness of the entire generation of the baby boomers is actually pretty sound, in that it's pretty clear that, one, the anti-war movement started amongst former Korean war vets and blue collar people before the students, but that there was no clear protest route for that, the way there was with the students. So there was no eventual politics that could have easily emerged. And two, that the baby like the population of the US that was students, and also the population of students that were anti-war did happen, but it happened late. And by that, the majority population, it happened later. And also, interestingly, was a much smaller portion of US society than, say, students are today. So carrying a narrative about that as if it's representative of a generation is a myth. Yeah, and the anti-war movement from World War II up into about the middle of Vietnam was actually very populist right driven. That's absolutely historically correct. Yeah, I think I don't want to. The first few articles I read by Rockhill, I was pretty hostile to, but the more I read about him, the more the more I listen to him fully articulate his arguments. They're not as vulgar as they seem. I'm not saying I'm on board with everything that he thinks was CIA op, but like, I think he's fundamentally, like, his analysis of Hannah Arendt is dead on. Oh yeah, no. Here's what ended the Vietnam War: industrial production, the Vietnamese army, and the Viet Cong. That's what ended the Vietnam War. Student movement didn't do that much. I mean, they have a statue to them, and it was nice moral support and all. I'm not saying that it was not worth doing. I don't want to. Rockhill talked about how Arendt was rewarded for going more and more right wing over time. Um, yeah, and I think, like, Rockhill's analysis of Marcuse is really solid. Solid. It's not salad. Sorry, my southern accent where I pronounce everything as A comes out. Um, However, where I get more frustrated with Lacerdo in particular is not so this is not Rockhill, this is Lacerdo. Is this not dealing with the fact that a lot of the splits in the West over the Sino-Soviet conflict and the division between, like, Dengist and other kinds of Maoist, a lot of people read Lacerdo and thought that he was asserting that all that was just Western stuff, and it absolutely historically is not. That was a debate within China too, And a lot of the Western arguments are poor parodies of Chinese ones. And the other thing I would like is if people really value um, Soviet and Chinese communism, they should cite it more and more thoroughly and more than just the big guy at the top. And I'm not coming at Rockhill for that because that's not Rockhill's agenda, but I am a little bit coming out Lacerda for that. The Western Marxism book I found very weird about how little it cited the counter story exactly. And again, I am psychoanalyzing a dead man. So and we've already talked about pundits. So take this with a grain of thought, with a salt. But we have to remember that Lacerda was at one time tied with a bunch of people in his party that were Euro communists that were fighting over the legacy of Togliatti. And some of that is what the Western Marxism book is about. For us, we're not in that context. We're not about these battles about, where the various Italian communist parties went. And so there's kind of a crypto debate that we've lost in our usage of that theorist. That's true for a lot of things. I mean, you read Karl Korsch, for example, Korsch's stuff about the critique of the Goethe program, and his reading of that was actually very much about the Görlitz program and the kind of Lassallean program that Bernstein was putting up in the late teens, 1920s, when he went back to the SPD. I like his liberalism book. I don't think saying something is not dialectical enough for a Hegelian scholar is kind of a bitch move, and so I'm not going to do it. It's I found that there was good points in the Liberalism and Counterhistory book, but that it didn't deal with the dialectical contradictions of liberalism quite thoroughly enough. And weirdly, a non-Marxist scholar like Jonathan Israel, if you read all of his crazy ass, big ass books on liberalism, you'd actually come away with a very clear portrayal of the weird way that there were both proprietarian and anti-proprietarian strains in liberalism, and the proprietarians were going to win out, but that even if we talk about classical liberalism, it's largely a post facto construct to erase the like proto-socialist stuff that was in there. I use certain Russian websites, comrade. Also, my partner has full EBSCO access, so I can get that stuff legally. But for example, I read the Western Marxism book before it was published, had an official English translation, because there was a bootleg publication of it floating around the internet somewhere. Same with the Stalin book too. And also Rockhill's pretty giving on a lot of his articles. If you ask, he'll largely, he's pretty forthcoming on that kind of stuff. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if he's considered politically unsound. I just know he's not a Marxist. I think that series of books is really good. It's just, it's asking people to read 9,000 pages on the history of liberalism, though. I mean, those 3 books are the only books that are about the same size as my collected editions of Capital. You have public EBSCO. We lost EBSCO access in secondary schools here. Boo. Yeah, okay, so good. I don't feel bad about reading the Stalin book for free. I have both the bootleg version and the current version around here somewhere. His Stalin book is a book that I find frustrating, because I agree with him, actually, that Stalin is used as a kind of boogeyman to not deal with the Soviet Union's progress, but also I sometimes think we don't look into the complications and possible historical mistakes. The Sunny book? Which Sunny book? Sunni book? You mean Ronald Sunni? Oh, Stalin the Pacifist Revolution. Okay. I haven't read it yet. Is it good? I read about 5 Stalin books last year and I got a little bit Stalined out. Because I realized I don't understand. I'll tell you the history of Soviet history that I don't understand. I got a good feel for perestroika and have a pretty good feel for high Stalinism and all that. I don't have a good feel for the late 60s and 70s. Yeah, we lost episode host in secondary school completely. My state's not willing to pay for it anymore. They said it was too expensive. We have to use academic search Premiere without EBSCO host. We do have other databases, but not EBSCO host. All right, I'll read it. I think that book said Stalin was something like an efficient CEO. I've heard, now when I think about it and looked at the book, I've heard them. Yeah, they love a good database, but I don't like paying for it, my friend. All right, I've been going for almost 2 hours. I'm going to give you guys 2 questions. So use them wisely because I need to go do some other work. I have to finish an article on Bordiga and I have to prep for lessons tomorrow and more meetings. So my job is an inordinate amount of meetings, which is weird. Beyond electoral politics, 1, we need to build social institutions. Without social institutions, we have no grounds to start to build a program. 2, we need to be working on coordinating union movements that are not dependent on union bureaucracy. 3, we need to be pushing social unionism as much as we can and community engagement of the unions. So those are the big beginning points, I think. I would say we're in a weird hazy period between post-political and pre-political, if you know what I mean. That's a kind of vague way of saying it, and I've already complained about vagueness, so let me tell you what I mean. I mean that we've had a political consciousness emerge that has instituted a lot of real stuff in the communities that we haven't coordinated in any meaningful way. We can talk about how there's no mass politics right now, but there's mass political sentiment. There's just not mass coordination. And while we throw the word organizing around a lot, we don't really agree on what that means. Okay, so that's one question. I'll answer the other 3. So, how do you parse Flannery O'Connor as a progressive or reactionary? Okay. Are you asking this because you know Flannery O'Connor is my distant cousin? And that I literally lived across the street from her grave for 2 years and went to her alma mater. And if you are, cool. And if you're not, also cool. I think she was progressive for a reactionary, and I know that's kind of a weird way to state it. Her views on race, for example, she was undoubtedly racist. Oh yeah, I grew up around Macon and Millersville. I went to Georgia College of State University, which used to be Georgia Women's College, which is her alma mater. She is Catholic, as is my mom's family, and they are distantly related. So yeah. And not only am I obsessed with her, I've literally been in her archives, and I used to routinely visit her grave. I used to walk by it going from college to my apartment every day. Yeah. Catholics and Jews in Georgia's boxcar. It's a really not a great uh not a great thing. I think she was a fairly devout Catholic, but I could she was not she was concerned about about certain kinds of reactionaryism that were common in the South, but by our standards, she would have still been reactionary. All right, one more question I'll answer. Can I ask you a philosophy question? What's your take on the notion of eternal return? Well, I'm not a Nietzschean. I'm also, as long as we admit that Nietzsche is reactionary, um, I am willing to say that we can use Nietzsche's work if we admit that it is reactionary oriented. I am willing to use reactionary thinking. I just think you always have to call a bird a bird. Um, but as far as the eternal return goes, I think Nietzsche meant it literally. I don't think we have a reason to take it metaphorically. That he thought that his notion of time meant that everything that would happen before would probably happen again at some point, and that we should live life with that double acknowledgement. Uh-oh. Varn is like a son of me is like claiming that nah, you're my dad. You don't want to be my dad. Um One, he's dead. And two, my great my great regret in life is I didn't get to punch him before I forgave him. All right, those are your questions. You have gotten the answers. Um yeah, I think Freud actually does mean it more metaphorically than Nietzsche does. All right. Um that's everything. Peace and good night. For some reason, when I said I was about to head out, the internet stopped working. All right. Viva patata. Take care. Time is a spiral.